Officer Bob Mitchell froze mid-step in the Big Mart parking lot, his coffee cup suspended inches from his lips as Thor's hackles rose like warning flags. 38 years wearing this badge, and he'd never seen his German Shepherd partner afraid until that December morning when the dog looked into a child's eyes and saw something that made his soul howl. The man holding the toddler wasn't her father. A woman's scream pierced the Christmas Eve air as shopping carts scattered like frightened birds. The little girl's blonde curls caught the falling snow, but her eyes, those tiny blue eyes, held the hollow stare of someone who'd seen too much darkness for 2 years on this earth. Bob's weathered hands trembled as memories of Martha's last Christmas crashed against this moment. She'd always said, "Trust the dog, Bob. Dogs know things we can't see." "All units, we have a code Adam at Big Mart," Bob radioed, his voice cutting through the winter silence. What had this monster done to that baby, and how many others were out there waiting in the cold? The snow fell harder now, coating Billings in a deceptive Christmas card beauty that couldn't hide the ugliness Bob Mitchell had witnessed in 38 years of police work. At 62, he'd planned to retire in 6 months, trade his badge for fishing trips, and maybe finally clean out Martha's sewing room. Instead, he sat in his patrol car with Thor, watching the Big Mart suspect through one-way glass, wondering how many more children were out there in the cold. Bob's weathered hands wrapped around his third cup of coffee, the bitter liquid doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled in his bones since Martha's funeral 3 years ago. The house on Elm Street felt too big now, too quiet, except for Thor's gentle snoring and the tick of the grandfather clock Martha had insisted they buy for their 25th anniversary. They'd planned to fill that house with children's laughter, but 30 years of trying, doctor's visits, and failed adoptions had left only empty bedrooms and shattered dreams. Thor lay beside Bob's desk, his massive German Shepherd frame taking up most of the available floor space. At 5 years old, the dog was in his prime, though the veterinarian had mentioned early signs of hip dysplasia, a cruel parallel to Bob's own aging body. Thor's dark brown eyes tracked every movement in the station, ears constantly alert. The dog had been Bob's partner for 4 years now, ever since they'd rescued him from a neglect case involving a meth lab. Something about Thor's protective instincts toward children had always been remarkable, almost supernatural in its intensity. The man they'd arrested gave his name as Marcus Davidson, 48 years old, from Bozeman. Clean record, steady employment as a mechanic until 6 months ago. But something about his story didn't add up. He claimed the little girl, Sophie Chen, was his niece, that he was taking her to visit grandmother for Christmas. When pressed for details, his answers became vague, contradictory. The grandmother's name changed twice. The address didn't exist. Sophie sat in the station's break room now, wrapped in a donated blanket, clutching a teddy bear one of the female officers had bought from the gift shop. The child hadn't spoken since they'd brought her in, just stared with those haunting blue eyes that had first caught Thor's attention. The paramedics found traces of a mild sedative in her system. Nothing dangerous, but enough to keep a toddler compliant during transport. Bob's pension would be $2,847 a month, barely enough to cover his mortgage and Thor's medical expenses. The department's budget cuts meant fewer K-9 units, and Thor would likely be reassigned to a younger officer. The thought of retirement had terrified Bob more than any armed suspect ever had. Without the badge, without Thor, what was he? Just another widower in a town full of them, counting days until his own name appeared in the obituary section. But looking at Sophie Chen, remembering Thor's urgent warning, Bob felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Martha always said dogs could see things humans missed. Maybe it was time to listen. The interrogation room felt smaller, with Marcus Davidson's desperation filling every corner. Bob sat across from the man, studying the trembling hands, the dark circles under bloodshot eyes, the way Marcus kept checking his phone even though they'd confiscated it hours ago. Thor lay by the door, still alert, still watching Marcus with that unwavering intensity that had started this whole investigation. "Tell me about Sophie," Bob said, his voice carrying the weight of nearly 4 decades of experience. "And this time, let's stick to the truth." Marcus's shoulders sagged as if an invisible weight had finally become too much to bear. "Her name isn't Sophie. It's Emma Rodriguez. She's been missing for 6 weeks from Texas." His voice cracked on the words. "I know how this looks, Officer Mitchell. I know what you think of me. But I'm not the monster here." Bob leaned back in his chair, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. Through the one-way mirror, he could see other officers gathering, listening. This was bigger than a simple kidnapping case, and everyone in the station could feel it. "Then help me understand, Marcus. Help me understand how a mechanic from Bozeman ends up with a missing child from Texas on Christmas Eve." The confession came in broken pieces, like a dam failing one crack at a time. Marcus Davidson was indeed a mechanic, or had been until 6 months ago when his daughter Emily was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The insurance company had found a pre-existing condition clause to deny coverage. The experimental treatment Emily needed cost $847,000. Marcus had sold his house, his truck, everything of value. It wasn't enough. "A man approached me at the hospital," Marcus whispered, staring at his hands. "Said his name was Vincent. He knew about Emily, knew about the medical bills. He said there was work available, good money, and that nobody would get hurt. Just transportation, just moving packages from one place to another." Bob felt his stomach turn. Packages. In the trafficking world, that's what they called children. "How many packages, Marcus?" "I don't know. I never saw them all together. Vincent would call, give me an address, tell me to pick up a package and deliver it to another location. Always different places. Old barns, abandoned buildings, sometimes just rest stops on the highway." Marcus looked up, his eyes pleading. I thought maybe they were undocumented kids being reunited with family. I told myself stories, Officer Mitchell. I had to." Thor suddenly stood, hackles rising again. Bob turned to see Detective Sarah Chen entering the room. Sarah was their trafficking specialist, a tough woman in her 40s who'd seen too much and trusted too little. Her expression was grim as she handed Bob a folder. "We ran the phone Marcus dropped," Sarah said. "The number that called belongs to a Vincent Crawford, former Montana State Police detective, retired under investigation in 2019. Bob, you worked with him 15 years ago on the Peterson case." The name hit Bob like a physical blow. Vincent Crawford, Vince. They'd been partners briefly, before Bob requested a transfer due to Vince's methods. There had been rumors, whispers about evidence that went missing, suspects who walked free on technicalities. Bob had never proven anything, but he'd never forgotten the feeling that something wasn't right. "Vince is behind this?" Bob's voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded miserably. "He said he knew police procedures, knew how to stay ahead of investigations. He was always one step ahead because he used to be one of you." The room fell silent except for the buzz of fluorescent lights and Thor's steady breathing. Bob thought about the children who might be out there, cold and frightened, while snow continued to fall outside. And the Weather Service had issued a blizzard warning. Temperatures would drop to -25 degrees tonight. Children wouldn't survive long in unheated buildings in this weather. "Where are the others, Marcus?" Bob asked quietly. "Where are the rest of the children?" "I don't know exactly. Vincent never told drivers the big picture. But..." Marcus pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "I found this in the last delivery truck. It fell out of Vincent's jacket." Bob unfolded the paper carefully. It was a hand-drawn map showing 3 locations marked with X's, rural properties, isolated, perfect for hiding children. 2 of the locations had dates scribbled next to them. The 3rd location, an abandoned grain elevator north of town, had tomorrow's date and the number 27 written in red ink. 27. 27 children. Jesus Christ, Sarah breathed, looking over Bob's shoulder. Thor moved to Bob's side, pressing against his leg. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of what they'd discovered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The blizzard was getting worse. Bob stood slowly, his knees protesting. At 62, he felt every year, every injury, every sleepless night. But looking at that map, thinking about 27 children alone in the cold, he felt something else. He felt the same fire that had driven him to become a cop in the first place, the same sense of purpose that had sustained him through Martha's illness and death. Sarah, get on the phone with the FBI. We need a task force mobilized. Bob folded the map carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Marcus, you're going to help us. You're going to make this right. Marcus nodded eagerly. Whatever you need. I'll do whatever you need to fix this. Bob looked down at Thor, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog had started this investigation with one simple act of recognition, one moment of pure instinct that had unraveled an entire trafficking network. What do you say, partner? Ready to bring some children home for Christmas? Thor's tail wagged once, a simple acknowledgement that said everything Bob needed to hear. They had work to do. The first location was a bust, but not in the way Bob had expected. The abandoned copper mine outside Billings showed clear signs of recent occupation, mattresses on the floor, empty food containers, children's drawings taped to the walls. But the children were gone, moved somewhere else in the network's rotation. Thor sniffed every corner of the underground chambers, his whines echoing off the stone walls like ghosts of the children who had been imprisoned there. They were here, Detective Sarah Chen said, photographing a small pile of children's clothes in one corner. Recent, too. These crackers are still fresh. She held up a half-eaten package of saltines, the kind they gave to sick kids. Bob knelt beside a drawing scratched into the dirt floor with a rock. A stick-figure child reaching toward a stick-figure dog. The dog had pointy ears and a collar with a star. One of them drew Thor, he whispered, his voice thick. Somehow, one of these kids dreamed about Thor coming to save them. The snow was falling harder now, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Bob's breath came out in white puffs as he studied Marcus Davidson's crude map. 2 more locations to check, and night was coming fast. In this weather, children wouldn't survive until morning in an unheated building. Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car, hands cuffed but cooperating fully. He'd been making phone calls at Bob's direction, trying to contact Vincent Crawford without revealing that the operation had been compromised. So far, Vincent wasn't answering his phone. "Try again," Bob ordered, sliding into the driver's seat. Thor jumped into his usual spot in the passenger area, alert and ready despite the long day. "And, Marcus, your daughter Emily is counting on you to help us save these other children. Don't forget that." Marcus nodded, dialing with shaking fingers. This time, someone answered. "About damn time," Vincent Crawford's voice came through the phone's speaker. Bob recognized the gravelly tone immediately, though it was rougher now, aged by years of bitterness and corruption. "Weather's getting bad, Marcus. We need to move up the timeline." Bob held his breath, watching Marcus struggle with the deception. "There's been a problem," Marcus said carefully. "The delivery. It got complicated. Police were asking questions." A long pause. Then Vincent's voice, sharp with suspicion. "What kind of questions? Did you stick to the story about the niece?" Yeah, but they had a K-9 unit. The dog, the dog knew something was wrong. They detained me for a few hours, but I convinced them it was a misunderstanding. Another pause. Bob could practically hear Vincent's mind working, calculating risks. Burned location, Vincent finally said. Can't use that pickup point again. Meet me at the grain elevator tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. We're moving all packages to the final destination early. What about the weather? Marcus asked. Vincent's laugh was cold. Weather's perfect. Keeps law enforcement busy with accidents and stuck vehicles. Nobody's going to be looking for missing kids in a blizzard. The line went dead. Bob stared at the phone, processing what they'd just heard. Final destination. Vincent was planning to move all 27 children somewhere else, somewhere Bob might never find them. He's going to kill them, isn't he? Marcus whispered from the back seat. The final destination. That's not another holding location. That's where children disappear forever. Bob didn't answer, but his hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd seen enough trafficking cases to know Marcus was probably right. 27 children were about to vanish without a trace, sold to the highest bidders or worse. The thought made his stomach turn. Thor suddenly lifted his head, ears perked. A moment later, Bob heard it too, sirens in the distance. The FBI task force Sarah had called for was finally arriving, but they were still hours away from being operational. By the time they organized a proper rescue operation, Vincent would be gone and the children with him. Bob made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, regardless of how it turned out. He reached for his radio and called dispatch. This is Officer Mitchell, badge number 2847. I need to report that I'm pursuing a lead in the trafficking case. We'll be out of radio contact for several hours due to weather conditions. Bob, wait! Sarah's voice crackled through the static. The FBI wants you to hold position until they arrive. Don't go in alone. Bob looked at his watch. 4:30 p.m. The grain elevator was 40 minutes away in good weather, probably twice that in the blizzard. If they left now, they could be in position before Vincent arrived at 6 a.m. If they waited for the FBI, those children would be gone forever. Sorry, Sarah. Can't wait. 27 kids won't survive another day in this cold. He turned off the radio before she could respond. Marcus leaned forward from the back seat. Officer Mitchell, I know what you're thinking, but Vincent, he's not working alone. He's got at least 2 other men with him, maybe more. They're armed and they won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way. Bob glanced at Thor in the rearview mirror. The dog was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes, as if he understood exactly what Bob was planning. They'd been partners for 4 years. Thor had never let him down, not once. Marcus, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Bob's voice was steady, but inside he felt the familiar pre-operation adrenaline starting to build. Your daughter, Emily, how much do you love her? More than my own life, Marcus answered without hesitation. Then you understand why I can't wait for backup. There are 27 children out there who love their parents just as much as Emily loves you. And their parents love them just as much as you love Emily. Bob started the engine, feeling the heater kick in against the brutal cold. We're going to get them back. As they drove through the worsening storm toward the grain elevator, Bob thought about Martha. She'd always said that love wasn't something you felt. It was something you did. 38 years ago, he'd taken an oath to serve and protect. Tonight, with Thor at his side and a blizzard raging around them, he was going to honor that oath one last time. The windshield wipers struggled against the heavy snow, and the defroster fought a losing battle against the fog. But Thor remained alert in the passenger seat, and somewhere ahead in the darkness, 27 children were waiting for rescue. Bob pressed harder on the gas pedal, racing against time, weather, and his own mortality. At 62, this would likely be his last case. He was determined to make it count. The grain elevator loomed against the storm like a monument to forgotten times, its concrete tower disappearing into the swirling snow. Bob cut the engine 200 yards away, letting the patrol car coast to a stop behind a collapsed barn that would provide cover. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving agricultural operation, now reduced to rust and decay. Thor immediately tensed, his nostrils flaring as he caught scents carried on the brutal wind. The dog's behavior told Bob everything he needed to know. Children were here, and they were terrified. "How many men does Vincent usually travel with?" Bob asked Marcus, pulling on his heavy winter gloves. The temperature had dropped to -28 degrees, and the wind chill made it feel like 40 below. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. "2, sometimes 3, Marcus replied, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air. "Tommy Briggs and Ray Santos. Both ex-military, both desperate for money. Tommy's got gambling debts. Ray lost his farm to medical bills after his wife's cancer treatment." Bob nodded grimly. More victims of a system that pushed good people past their breaking points. But sympathy wouldn't help the children trapped in that grain elevator, slowly freezing to death. Through his binoculars, Bob could see tire tracks in the snow leading to the main building. Fresh tracks made within the last few hours. A refrigerated semi-truck was parked near the loading dock, its engine running to keep the cargo area from freezing completely. Bob's stomach turned as he realized the truck was probably their transportation for moving the children to the final destination. "Officer Mitchell," Marcus said quietly, "there's something else you need to know about Vincent. He's not just corrupt. He's completely lost his mind. Last time I met with him, he was talking about how these kids were better off with him than with their families. Said he was saving them from poverty, abuse, neglect. He actually believes he's doing them a favor." Bob lowered the binoculars, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. A delusional trafficker was infinitely more dangerous than a simple criminal. Vincent wouldn't just kill to protect his operation. He'd kill because he believed it was righteous. Thor suddenly stood, hackles rising, staring toward the grain elevator. A moment later, Bob heard it too. A child's scream, quickly muffled but unmistakably there. The sound cut through the wind like a knife through his heart. "That's it," Bob growled, checking his service weapon. "I'm not waiting any longer." He radioed dispatch one final time, knowing the signal was weak but hoping someone would hear. "This is Officer Mitchell at the old Hartley Grain Elevator, County Road 47. Multiple children in immediate danger. Requesting backup and medical assistance. If you can't reach me, tell my story. Tell them about Thor." The radio crackled with static, then fell silent. Bob looked at Thor, seeing his own determination reflected in the dog's dark eyes. "Ready, partner?" They moved through the snow like ghosts, using the abandoned farm equipment as cover. Bob's joints ached from the cold, reminding him that he was 62 years old and probably too old for this kind of operation. But the thought of 27 children freezing to death pushed him forward. The grain elevator had been built in the 1940s, a massive concrete structure designed to store thousands of tons of wheat. Now it served as a prison. Bob could see light coming from windows high up in the tower, and he caught glimpses of movement. Vincent had chosen well. The building was isolated, easily defensible, and had multiple levels where children could be hidden. As they approached the main entrance, Thor suddenly froze. He'd detected something Bob couldn't see or hear. The dog's training kicked in, and he began the silent alert sequence they'd practiced hundreds of times. One person ahead, armed, approximately 30 feet away. Bob crept forward until he could see around the corner of the building. Tommy Briggs stood guard at a side entrance, smoking a cigarette and stamping his feet to stay warm. The man looked miserable, constantly checking his watch and muttering complaints about the weather. Bob made a difficult decision. He needed to take Tommy down quietly, without alerting Vincent or Ray to his presence. But that meant leaving Thor behind momentarily. and the dog wouldn't like it. "Stay," Bob whispered to Thor, holding up his hand in the command gesture. "Stay and watch." Thor's ears drooped slightly, but he obeyed, settling into a position where he could observe both Bob and the building. Bob moved carefully through the snow, using the sound of the wind to mask his approach. Tommy was focused on staying warm and didn't notice the danger until Bob was directly behind him. "Don't move, Tommy," Bob said quietly, pressing his service weapon against the man's back. "Don't make a sound." Tommy's cigarette dropped into the snow with a soft hiss. "Jesus, how did you—" "Hands behind your back. Now." Bob cuffed Tommy quickly, then searched him for weapons. He found a pistol and a knife, both of which he tossed into a snowbank. "How many children are in there?" "I don't know, man. Vincent doesn't tell us details. Maybe 20, maybe 30. They're up in the storage bins." Tommy's voice shook, and not just from the cold. "Look, officer, I never wanted to hurt kids. I just owed some bad people money, and Vincent said this was easy work. Transport only, no violence." "Where are Vincent and Ray?" "Vincent's up in the control room, 3rd floor. Ray's with the kids, making sure they stay quiet." Tommy looked at Bob with desperate eyes. "Those kids are in bad shape, officer. They've been in there for hours without heat. Some of the little ones stopped crying an hour ago." Bob felt ice form in his veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. Children who stopped crying in cold conditions were entering the final stages of hypothermia. They were running out of time. He secured Tommy to a fence post where he wouldn't freeze to death but couldn't escape, then whistled softly for Thor. The dog appeared instantly, having waited exactly where Bob had left him. "Multiple targets, multiple levels," Bob whispered to Thor. "Children in danger, you know what to do." They entered the grain elevator through the side door Tommy had been guarding. The interior was a maze of catwalks, conveyor belts, and massive storage bins that had once held grain but now served a far more sinister purpose. Bob could hear voices echoing from somewhere above, men talking, children whimpering. The building was essentially a concrete tower with multiple levels connected by metal stairs and walkways. Bob's breath came out in white puffs as he climbed, Thor moving silently beside him. The cold inside the building was almost as brutal as outside, and Bob couldn't imagine how terrified children could survive these conditions. On the 2nd level, they found the first evidence of the trafficking operation. Sleeping bags, food containers, portable heaters that had run out of fuel. This had been a temporary staging area, but the children had been moved higher up where they'd be more secure. Thor suddenly alerted again, pointing toward a stairwell leading to the 3rd level. Bob could hear Ray Santos's voice now, rough and impatient. "Stop that crying or you'll get something to really cry about." A child's voice, small and frightened. "I want my mommy." "Your mommy ain't coming, kid. Nobody's coming. Now shut up and eat this." Bob felt rage building in his chest, a white-hot fury that made him forget about the cold, forget about his age, forget about everything except getting to those children. He signaled Thor to follow and began climbing the stairs. The 3rd level opened into a large room that had once housed the grain elevator's control mechanisms. Now it had been converted into a makeshift dormitory. Bob counted quickly. 23 children, ranging in age from barely 2 years old to perhaps 8. They were huddled together on mattresses, sharing thin blankets, their lips blue from cold. Ray Santos stood with his back to the stairwell, holding a pistol loosely in one hand while eating a sandwich with the other. He was a big man, probably 45, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. Bob made another split-second decision. He couldn't risk a gunfight with 23 children in the crossfire. He needed to get Ray away from the kids. "Ray Santos," Bob called out, stepping into view with his weapon drawn. "Police, put down your weapon and step away from the children." Ray spun around, raising his pistol, but Thor was already in motion. The German shepherd launched himself across the room like a furry missile, hitting Ray in the chest and driving him backward away from the children. The two rolled across the floor, Thor's jaws clamped on Ray's gun hand. "Get the gun! Get the gun!" one of the older children screamed. Bob rushed forward as Ray's pistol skittered across the concrete floor. Ray was trying to beat Thor off with his free hand, but the dog held on with the determination that had made German shepherds legendary police partners. "Let go of the dog!" Ray shouted. "Call him off!" "Not until you're cuffed," Bob replied, kicking Ray's gun further away. "Thor, hold!" Thor maintained his grip but stopped shaking his head, holding Ray's arm immobile while Bob secured the handcuffs. As soon as Ray was restrained, Bob turned to the children. They stared at him with wide, frightened eyes, not sure if he was another captor or actually there to help them. "It's okay," Bob said gently, holstering his weapon and pulling out his badge. "I'm Officer Mitchell with the Montana State Police. This is Thor. We're here to take you home." The response was immediate and heartbreaking. Several of the children began crying, not from fear this time, but from relief. Others rushed toward Thor, who immediately shifted from police dog to therapy animal, allowing the children to pet him and hold on to his thick fur. But Bob's relief was short-lived. Through the windows he could see Vincent Crawford climbing the external fire escape toward the 4th level. Vincent had heard the commotion and was trying to escape, but he was also moving toward the building's highest point. If he got there, he could pick off Bob and the children from above. "Ray, where's the heater?" Bob demanded. "These children are freezing." "Propane ran out yesterday," Ray mumbled, his hand still bleeding from Thor's bite. "Vincent said it didn't matter. Said we were moving them today anyway." Bob looked at the children again, really seeing them this time. Several were showing advanced signs of hypothermia. Blue lips, sluggish movements, confusion. They needed medical attention immediately, but they also needed to get warm right now, or some of them wouldn't survive the rescue. He keyed his radio, hoping for a miracle. "Any unit, this is Officer Mitchell at the Hartley grain elevator. I have 23 children in immediate medical distress. Need ambulances and warming equipment now." Static answered him, but then faintly he heard Sarah Chen's voice. Bob, if you can hear this, help is coming. FBI team is 20 minutes out. Ambulances right behind them." 20 minutes. Bob looked at the children, then up toward the 4th level where Vincent was hiding. 20 minutes felt like forever, but it was the first good news he'd had all day. Thor moved among the children, his body heat helping to warm the smallest ones. The dog seemed to understand exactly what was needed, positioning himself to provide maximum comfort while staying alert for threats. But as Bob prepared to secure the floor and wait for backup, he heard Vincent Crawford's voice echoing down from above. "Hello, Bobby. Still playing the hero? Some things never change, do they?" Bob's blood ran cold. Vincent wasn't trying to escape. He was setting up for a final confrontation, with 23 children caught in the middle. Vincent Crawford's voice echoed through the grain elevator like the ghost of Bob's past, coming back to haunt him. 15 years ago, they'd been partners. 15 years ago, Bob had trusted this man with his life. Now, Vincent held 23 children hostage in a freezing concrete tomb, and Bob could hear the madness in his former partner's laughter. "You always were too soft, Bobby," Vincent continued from somewhere above. "Remember the Henderson case? You wanted to follow procedure, wait for backup, do everything by the book. Meanwhile, 3 more kids died while you filled out paperwork." Bob positioned himself between the children and the stairwell leading to the 4th level, his service weapon drawn. Thor moved to Bob's side, hackles raised, sensing the escalating tension. The children huddled together on their mattresses, the older ones trying to comfort the younger ones who were crying again. "That's enough, Vince," Bob called back. "It's over. Release the remaining children and surrender. You're surrounded." Vincent's laughter was harsh and bitter. "Surrounded? By who? You're alone, old man, just like you've been alone since Martha died. just like you'll die alone when I put a bullet in your head." The mention of Martha's name hit Bob like a physical blow. Vincent had attended her funeral, had stood beside Bob at the graveside, had offered comfort during the darkest period of Bob's life. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. "Don't you dare speak her name," Bob growled, his voice carrying a fury that made even Thor look up at him with concern. "Martha, Martha, Martha," Vincent taunted. "Sweet Martha who wanted kids so badly but couldn't have them. You know what's funny, Bobby? I've got more kids here than you ever did. I'm taking better care of them than their real parents ever could." One of the children, a boy of about 6 with dark hair and frightened eyes, tugged on Bob's jacket. "Mr. Policeman," he whispered, "the bad man upstairs. He said he was taking us to Disney World. But this isn't Disney World." Bob knelt beside the boy, his heart breaking. "What's your name, son?" "Dylan Murphy. I'm from Colorado. The bad man took me from my school playground." Dylan's voice was barely audible, but his words carried the weight of every parent's worst nightmare. Bob looked around at the other children, seeing the same story reflected in their faces. These weren't runaways or kids from broken homes. These were loved children, snatched from playgrounds and schools and front yards, torn away from families who were probably still searching for them. "Dylan, I need you to be very brave for me," Bob said quietly. "Can you help me take care of the younger children while I deal with the bad man?" Dylan nodded solemnly, and Bob watched as the 6-year-old moved among the toddlers, sharing his thin blanket and whispering reassurances. The resilience of children never ceased to amaze Bob, even in the darkest circumstances. Thor suddenly tensed, his ears pricked toward the ceiling. A moment later, Bob heard footsteps directly overhead. Vincent was moving, repositioning himself for something. Bob's training kicked in as he analyzed the tactical situation. Vincent had the high ground, knew the building's layout, and was presumably armed. Bob had 23 innocent lives to protect and limited cover. "Tell me something, Bobby." Vincent's voice came from a different location now, closer to the stairwell. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd had kids? If Martha had lived? If you weren't just a lonely old cop counting days until retirement?" Bob forced himself to stay calm, but Vincent's words were finding their mark. The psychological warfare was deliberate, designed to make Bob emotional and careless. It was exactly the kind of manipulation Vincent had always been good at. "I think about it every day," Bob replied honestly. "But I've learned something, Vince. Family isn't just about blood. Sometimes it's about who you choose to protect." A small girl with blonde pigtails crawled toward Bob on hands and knees. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old, and her lips were blue from the cold. "Are you my daddy?" she asked, her words slurred from hypothermia. Bob's chest tightened as he gathered the little girl into his arms, sharing his body heat. "No, sweetheart, but I'm going to make sure you get back to your daddy real soon." "That's touching, Bobby," Vincent called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Playing house with stolen children. You know what I see when I look at these kids? I see inventory. I see products that can be sold to people who will appreciate them more than their neglectful parents ever did." The casual cruelty of Vincent's words made Bob's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain focused. Through the windows he could see the snow continuing to fall, but in the distance he thought he glimpsed flashing lights. The FBI team Sarah had called might actually be arriving. Thor suddenly barked once, sharp and urgent. Bob turned to see what had caught the dog's attention and felt his heart stop. Vincent Crawford stood at the top of the stairwell, pointing a high-powered rifle directly at the group of children. At 55, Vincent looked older than his years. His hair had gone completely gray, deep lines etched his face, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had lost his soul piece by piece. He wore a tactical vest and carried enough ammunition to kill everyone in the building. "Step away from the children, Bobby," Vincent said, his voice eerily calm now. "You're interfering with a legitimate business operation." "Legitimate?" Bob kept his weapon trained on Vincent but couldn't risk a shot with children so close to the line of fire. "You're trafficking children, Vince. These are babies, for God's sake." "These are products," Vincent corrected. "Unwanted products from broken homes, headed to clients who will value them properly. I'm providing a service, Bobby. I'm matching supply with demand." One of the older children, a girl of about 8, spoke up with the kind of courage that only comes from pure innocence. "My mommy and daddy want me. They love me very much. They read me stories every night and make me pancakes on Sunday." Vincent's face twisted into something ugly. "Your parents reported you missing to collect insurance money. They don't want you back. None of your parents want you back." The lie was so casual, so delivered with such conviction that Bob realized Vincent actually believed it. Somewhere along the way, the former detective had constructed an elaborate delusion to justify his crimes. In Vincent's mind, he wasn't a monster. He was a savior. "Look around you, Vince," Bob said, trying to reach whatever humanity might be left in his former partner. "Look at these children. They're cold, they're scared, they're sick. This isn't saving them. This is torture." Vincent's grip on his rifle tightened. "They'll adjust. Children are resilient. They'll learn to appreciate what I've given them, a chance at a better life than the one they were born into." Thor moved slightly, positioning himself between Vincent and the smallest children. The dog's instincts were flawless, recognizing Vincent as the primary threat, while also serving as a living shield for the most vulnerable. "You want to know the truth, Bobby?" Vincent continued, his voice taking on a confessional tone. "I started this because I needed money. Gambling debts, bad investments, a pension that couldn't cover my ex-wife's alimony. But somewhere along the way, I realized I was actually helping these kids. Taking them away from parents who didn't deserve them, giving them to people who could provide better lives." Bob studied Vincent's face, seeing the genuine conviction there. This wasn't just greed anymore. It was a complete psychological break from reality. Vincent had rewritten history in his mind, transforming himself from predator to protector. "What about Emily Davidson?" Bob asked. "Marcus's daughter with leukemia. Was she going to get a better life too?" For the first time, Vincent's confidence wavered. "That was different. Marcus needed money for treatment. It was a business transaction." "And Sophie Chen, the 2-year-old Thor detected at the store? What better life were you planning for her?" Vincent's hands began to shake slightly. "You don't understand. The system is broken, Bobby. These children fall through the cracks anyway. At least this way, they end up with people who can afford to take care of them." The sound of approaching sirens finally reached the grain elevator, growing louder despite the storm. Vincent heard them too, and his delusion began to crack under the pressure of reality. "You called backup," he said, his voice turning cold and dangerous again. "You've ruined everything." "It's over, Vince," Bob said gently. "Put down the rifle and let these children go home to their families. Let me help you." Vincent looked around the room at the children as if seeing them clearly for the first time. Some were crying, others stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. The little girl in Bob's arms had fallen asleep from exhaustion and hypothermia. For a moment, Bob thought Vincent might surrender. The rifle wavered in his hands and something human flickered behind his eyes. But then the sirens grew louder, and Vincent's face hardened into resolve. "If I can't save them," Vincent said quietly, "then nobody can." He raised the rifle toward the children, and Bob knew with crystal clarity that his former partner intended to kill every child in the room rather than let them be returned to their neglectful families. Time slowed to a crawl. Bob could see Vincent's finger tightening on the trigger, could see the muzzle of the rifle swinging toward Dylan Murphy and the other children. He could hear Thor's warning growl, could feel the little girl's weight in his arms, could smell the fear and cold that permeated the room. Bob Mitchell, 62 years old and 6 months from retirement, made the last tactical decision of his career. He dove forward, shielding as many children as possible with his body, while simultaneously giving Thor the command that would change everything. "Thor, attack!" The German Shepherd launched himself at Vincent Crawford like a furry missile. 48 pounds of muscle, training, and pure protective instinct focused on eliminating the threat to his pack. As the two figures collided at the top of the stairwell, Bob heard the rifle discharge into the ceiling, sending concrete dust raining down on the children below. The battle for 23 innocent lives had begun. The collision between Thor and Vincent sent both of them tumbling down the metal staircase in a tangle of limbs, fur, and fury. The rifle clattered away into the darkness below as Vincent screamed, more in rage than pain. Bob heard the sickening sound of bodies hitting concrete and steel, followed by an ominous silence that made his heart stop. "Thor!" Bob shouted, but he couldn't leave the children to check on his partner. 23 terrified faces looked up at him, some crying, others too shocked to make any sound at all. The little girl in his arms had awakened at the noise and was trembling uncontrollably. Dylan Murphy, the 6-year-old from Colorado who had appointed himself as helper, tugged on Bob's sleeve. "Is the good dog okay, Mr. Policeman?" Before Bob could answer, he heard movement from below. Heavy breathing, a groan of pain, then Vincent's voice calling out in fury. "You think your mutt can save you, Bobby?" "I've got nothing left to lose now." Bob positioned himself at the top of the stairwell, service weapon drawn, trying to peer down into the shadows. The grain elevator's interior was a maze of catwalks and machinery, with dozens of places where Vincent could hide and ambush them. But Bob's primary concern wasn't Vincent anymore. It was Thor's silence. The sound of sirens was getting closer now, probably only minutes away, but in a situation like this, minutes could feel like hours. Bob needed to keep Vincent away from the children until help arrived, but he also needed to know if Thor was alive. "Vincent, listen to me," Bob called down. "It's over. The FBI is here. Surrender now and maybe you can get a deal." Vincent's laughter echoed up from the darkness, unhinged and bitter. "A deal? For what? They'll give me life in prison or the death penalty. Either way, I'm done. But I'm not going alone, Bobby. If I can't save these children, then nobody can." The fanatical conviction in Vincent's voice chilled Bob more than the sub-zero temperature. This wasn't just a cornered criminal anymore. This was a man who had completely lost touch with reality, convinced that murdering children would somehow be an act of mercy. A small sound from below made Bob's heart leap. A whimper, barely audible, but unmistakably canine. Thor was alive, but he was hurt. Bob could hear the dog trying to move, probably attempting to climb back up the stairs despite his injuries. One of the older children, a girl of about 7 with brown pigtails, crawled over to Bob. "My name is Emma Santos," she whispered. "I've been here for 3 weeks. The bad man, he talks to himself a lot. He thinks we can't hear him, but we can. He says our parents sold us because they didn't want us anymore." Bob knelt down to Emma's level, his heart breaking at the matter-of-fact way she delivered this information. "Emma, honey, that's not true. Your parents have been looking for you every single day. They love you very much and they want you to come home." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Really? The bad man said they forgot about me because Christmas was coming and they needed money for presents for other kids." "That's a lie," Bob said firmly. "Your parents would give up every Christmas present in the world just to have you back." The psychological damage Vincent had inflicted on these children was going to take years to heal. Bob realized that Vincent's delusion went deeper than just convincing himself that trafficking was justified. He had systematically brainwashed the children to believe they were unwanted, making them easier to control and less likely to try to escape. A metallic clang from below indicated that Vincent was moving through the machinery, possibly trying to find another way up to the children's level. Bob knew the layout of grain elevators from other cases. There were multiple access points, including external fire escapes and maintenance ladders. Vincent could attack from any direction. "Okay, kids, listen to me very carefully," Bob said, gathering all 23 children into the center of the room, away from windows and stairwells. "I need you all to lie down flat on the floor and stay as quiet as mice. Can you do that for me?" The children obeyed immediately, their weeks of captivity having taught them to follow adult instructions without question. Bob positioned himself between them and the most likely attack routes, wishing he had more ammunition and better cover. That's when he heard it, the blessed sound of Thor's paws on metal stairs. The German Shepherd appeared at the top of the stairwell, limping badly on his left front leg and bleeding from a gash on his head, but alert and determined. The dog immediately moved to the children, allowing them to touch him for comfort while maintaining his protective stance. "Good boy," Bob whispered, relief flooding through him. "Good boy, Thor." But their reunion was cut short by the sound of breaking glass. Vincent had found another way up and was coming through one of the windows on the opposite side of the room. Bob spun around, weapon raised, just as Vincent appeared with a pistol in each hand. Vincent looked like a man possessed. His clothes were torn from his fall down the stairs, blood streamed from a cut on his forehead, and his eyes held the wild look of someone who had abandoned all reason. "Final lesson, children," he announced in a sing-song voice that was more terrifying than any scream. "Sometimes people have to die to be saved." "Vincent, stop!" Bob shouted, but he couldn't get a clear shot with children so close to Vincent's position. "These kids have nothing to do with whatever broke inside you." "Let them go." "Broke inside me?" Vincent laughed, raising both pistols. "Nothing's broken, Bobby. I see clearly for the first time in my life. These children are trapped in a world that doesn't want them. I'm setting them free." Thor suddenly barked, not his alert bark or his attack bark, but something Bob had never heard before. It was a sound of pure anguish, as if the dog understood exactly what Vincent intended and was pleading for the lives of the children he'd sworn to protect. The sound seemed to penetrate even Vincent's madness. For a moment he hesitated, looking down at the children who were staring up at him with terrified eyes. Several of the youngest were crying again, and their tears seemed to trigger something in Vincent's fractured psyche. "Don't cry," he said, his voice suddenly gentle. "It won't hurt. I promise it won't hurt." Bob saw his chance. While Vincent was distracted by the children's tears, Bob lunged forward, tackling his former partner around the waist and driving them both to the floor. The pistols went off as they fell, bullets embedding harmlessly in the concrete ceiling. They wrestled on the cold floor, two aging men fighting for the lives of 23 children. Vincent was bigger and stronger, but Bob had 40 years of experience and the motivation of a man protecting his family. Because that's what these children had become to him. His family. The family he and Martha had never been able to have. Thor tried to help, but his injured leg couldn't support an attack. Instead, the dog positioned himself over the smallest children, using his body as a shield in case any more shots were fired. Bob managed to get control of one of Vincent's pistols, but Vincent still had the other. They rolled across the floor, each trying to gain advantage, their breath coming in white puffs in the frigid air. "You don't understand," Vincent gasped as they struggled. "I'm saving them from a lifetime of disappointment. Their parents will forget about them eventually. Everyone always forgets." "No," Bob grunted, trying to wrench the second pistol away. "You're wrong. Love doesn't forget. Love never gives up." That's when the grain elevator exploded with light and sound as FBI agents stormed through multiple entrances simultaneously. FBI, drop your weapons! Everyone on the ground! Vincent's eyes went wide as he realized it was truly over. For a moment, Bob thought his former partner might surrender. But then Vincent smiled, a sad, broken smile that spoke of a man who had lost everything that ever mattered to him. "I'm sorry, Martha," Vincent whispered, though Bob couldn't understand why he was apologizing to Bob's dead wife. Vincent raised his remaining pistol, but instead of pointing it at Bob or the children, he turned it toward himself. Bob lunged forward, trying to stop him, but Thor was faster. Despite his injuries, the German Shepherd launched himself at Vincent one final time, knocking the gun aside just as it discharged. The bullet meant for Vincent's head instead shattered his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a concrete support pillar. He hit with a sickening thud and didn't get up. In the sudden silence that followed, Bob could hear the most beautiful sound in the world: 23 children breathing, crying, calling for their parents. They were alive. They were safe. They were going home. Thor collapsed beside Bob, exhausted and bleeding, but victorious. The dog had completed his mission. Every child under his protection was safe. The grain elevator transformed into organized chaos as FBI agents, paramedics, and emergency responders flooded the building. Bob sat on the cold concrete floor, his back against a support beam, watching as medical teams worked frantically to stabilize the children. Thor lay beside him, the dog's head resting on Bob's lap, while a veterinarian examined his injuries by flashlight. "Compound fracture of the radius," the vet murmured, gently probing Thor's injured leg. "Possible concussion, multiple lacerations, severe exhaustion. He needs surgery immediately. But honestly, Officer Mitchell, I'm amazed he's still conscious. Most dogs would have collapsed hours ago." Bob stroked Thor's fur, feeling the dog's steady breathing against his leg. "He's not most dogs." He knew those children were counting on him. 23 children were being evaluated by medical teams, their small bodies wrapped in emergency blankets as paramedics checked for hypothermia, dehydration, and other injuries. Some cried for their parents, others sat in stunned silence, but all were alive. All were going home. Agent Sarah Chen approached Bob, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "The other 4 children from the map locations have been found, all alive, all safe. We got them all, Bob, all 27. Bob nodded, too emotionally drained to feel the triumph he should have felt. Vincent Crawford was being loaded onto a stretcher, unconscious but stable. The man who had once been Bob's partner was now facing life in prison for human trafficking, kidnapping, and attempted murder. "What about Marcus Davidson?" Bob asked. "Cooperating fully? His testimony is going to dismantle the entire network." "We've already made arrests in 3 other states." Sarah paused, studying Bob's face. "The U.S. attorney wants to recommend him for minimum sentence in exchange for his cooperation. His daughter Emily is responding well to treatment." A small voice interrupted their conversation. "Mr. Policeman?" Bob looked down to see Dylan Murphy, the 6-year-old from Colorado who had helped care for the younger children. The boy's parents had driven through the blizzard from Denver and were somewhere in the building, being briefed by FBI agents before the reunion. "What is it, Dylan? Is the good dog going to be okay?" Dylan's eyes were wide with concern as he looked at Thor's bandaged leg. Bob glanced at the veterinarian, who gave a slight nod. "He's going to be fine, son. Thor's tough. He'll heal up good as new." Dylan carefully reached out to pet Thor's head. "Thank you for saving us, good dog. You're the bravest dog in the whole world." Thor's tail wagged weakly, and for a moment Bob saw past the injuries and exhaustion to the heart of the animal who had become his partner, his family, his salvation. Thor had given everything he had to protect those children, just as he'd given everything to fill the empty spaces in Bob's life after Martha died. More families began arriving as the storm cleared enough for travel. Bob watched reunion after reunion, parents clutching children they thought they'd lost forever, tears mixing with laughter in the harsh fluorescent light of the grain elevator. Each reunion was a small miracle, a prayer answered, a family made whole again. Emma Santos, the 7-year-old with brown pigtails, was claimed by parents who drove from New Mexico. They sobbed as they held their daughter, whispering apologies for not protecting her, promises that she'd never be alone again. The little girl who had fallen asleep in Bob's arms during the crisis was reunited with grandparents from Nebraska. Her parents had died in a car accident 6 months earlier, and she'd been living with her elderly grandparents when she was taken from their front yard. The grandfather, a man in his 70s with weathered hands and kind eyes, shook Bob's hand with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "She's all we have left of our son. Without her..." Bob understood. Family wasn't always about blood or traditional structures. Sometimes it was about who you'd die to protect, who you'd live to serve, who gave your life meaning when everything else fell apart. As the evacuation continued, a federal prosecutor approached Bob with paperwork. "Officer Mitchell, we'll need your full statement, but I wanted you to know this case is going to change federal trafficking laws. The Thor Protocol, they're calling it. Mandatory K-9 units for all trafficking investigations." Bob looked down at Thor, who was being prepared for transport to an emergency veterinary clinic. He'd like that. He always knew his job was protecting kids. The prosecutor paused, studying Bob's face. "There's something else. The media has picked up this story. You and Thor are being called heroes. There's already talk of a presidential citation for valor." "We were just doing our job," Bob replied. But his words lacked conviction. They had done more than their job. They had walked into hell and brought 27 children back to the light. As Thor was loaded onto a stretcher for transport to the veterinary hospital, Bob made a decision that surprised even him. He wouldn't retire in 6 months. He couldn't retire. Not when there were other children out there, other Thors waiting to be trained, other officers who needed to learn what he and his partner had discovered in that grain elevator. Love wasn't something you felt, it was something you did. And sometimes when you chose love over fear, when you chose action over safety, when you chose others over yourself, you didn't just save lives. You found the meaning that had been missing from your own. The last child to be reunited was Dylan Murphy. His parents burst through the door of the grain elevator like forces of nature, gathering their son into their arms and lifting him off the ground. Dylan's father, a tall man with tears streaming down his face, approached Bob. "Officer Mitchell, we can never repay what you've done. Dylan told us about the good dog who protected them all. Where is he?" Bob pointed to the stretcher where Thor lay, sedated but stable. "Right there. Thor. He's the real hero of this story." Dylan's mother knelt beside Thor's stretcher and gently kissed the dog's forehead. "Thank you for bringing our baby home." As Bob watched the families leave the grain elevator, carrying their children back into the storm toward warm cars and safe homes, he realized something profound. He and Martha had never had children of their own, but tonight he'd been a father to 27 kids who needed him most. Thor had taught him that heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and acting anyway. It was about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when extraordinary choices were needed. The blizzard was ending, and somewhere in the distance, dawn was breaking on Christmas Day. The memorial service for Thor was held on a crisp January morning, 3 weeks after the grain elevator rescue. Snow covered the grounds of the Montana State Police headquarters. but the sun shone brightly through bare tree branches, casting long shadows across the assembled crowd. Bob Mitchell stood at the podium, looking out at over 300 people who had come to honor his fallen partner. In the front row sat the families of the rescued children. Dylan Murphy and his parents had driven up from Colorado. Emma Santos held her mother's hand while her father dabbed at his eyes with a tissue. Sophie Chen, now back with her biological family after a lengthy custody resolution, clutched a stuffed German shepherd that looked remarkably like Thor. 27 children and their families, all present because one dog had chosen to act when action was needed most. Bob cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. Thor wasn't just my partner for 4 years. He was my teacher, my conscience, and toward the end, my salvation. When Martha died 3 years ago, I thought my purpose had died with her. I was counting days until retirement, going through the motions of a job I'd once loved. Then Thor came into my life, and everything changed. The casket beside the podium was draped with an American flag and surrounded by flowers, drawings, and toys left by the children Thor had saved. Bob had to pause for a moment, overcome by the sight of so many tributes to a dog who had never asked for recognition, only the chance to serve. Thor taught me that heroism isn't about being fearless, Bob continued. It's about being afraid and acting anyway. He was afraid that day in the grain elevator. I could see it in his eyes. But he also saw children who needed protecting, and that was all that mattered to him. He chose love over fear, service over safety, others over himself. In the crowd, Bob spotted Marcus Davidson, accompanied by his wife Sarah and daughter Emily. Marcus was serving weekends in county jail while providing ongoing testimony against the trafficking network, but he'd been granted permission to attend the service. Emily looked healthy now, her hair growing back thick and brown after successful cancer treatment. She held a handmade card with Thor's picture on it, colored in crayon with the words, "Thank you for saving Daddy," written in a child's careful script. The investigation that had grown from Thor's initial alert at Big Mart had dismantled a trafficking network spanning 6 states. Vincent Crawford was serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. 47 additional children had been recovered through leads developed from the case. The Thor protocol had been implemented nationwide, requiring K-9 units for all human trafficking investigations. But none of those achievements felt as important to Bob as the simple fact that 27 children were home with their families. Agent Sarah Chen stepped forward to present Bob with Thor's Medal of Valor, the highest honor bestowed upon police dogs. As she pinned the medal to Thor's tactical vest, she whispered something to the fallen hero that only Bob could hear. "Thank you for teaching us what it means to serve." After the formal ceremony, families approached Bob one by one. Each had a story about how Thor's sacrifice had changed their lives. Dylan Murphy's father, a construction worker with calloused hands and tears in his eyes, shook Bob's hand and said, "My boy talks about Thor every day. Says he wants to be brave like the good dog when he grows up." Emma Santos's mother, a teacher from New Mexico, handed Bob a letter written by her daughter's entire second-grade class. 23 children had written thank you notes to Thor, each one decorated with drawings of dogs wearing police badges. "They don't understand death yet," she explained, "but they understand heroism." The most difficult moment came when Sophie Chen's grandmother approached the casket. The elderly woman knelt beside it and placed a small photo on the flag. It showed Sophie laughing on a swing set, the picture taken just days before her kidnapping. "He brought back her smile," the grandmother whispered. "We didn't think we'd ever see it again." As the crowd began to disperse, Bob found himself alone with Thor's casket. He knelt beside it and placed his hand on the flag, feeling the weight of everything they'd shared together. 4 years of partnership, countless calls, Hundreds of training sessions and one perfect moment when everything they'd worked for had mattered more than life itself. "I kept my promise, partner," Bob said quietly. "All the children made it home. Every single one." A small voice behind him made Bob turn around. Dylan Murphy stood there with his parents holding something in his hands. "Officer Bob," the 6-year-old said, "I made this for Thor." It was a drawing, carefully done in colored pencils, showing a German shepherd with wings flying above a group of children. At the top, in Dylan's careful printing, were the words, "Guardian Angel Thor." Bob accepted the drawing with hands that shook slightly. "He'd love this, Dylan. Thank you." "Is Thor in heaven now?" Dylan asked, with the directness of childhood. Bob looked at the drawing, then at Dylan's earnest face, then at the families still gathered around the memorial. "Yes, son, he's in heaven. And you know what? I think he's still watching over all of you." 3 months later, Bob stood in the same spot where Thor's memorial service had been held, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him sat Luna, a 2-year-old German shepherd rescued from a trafficking operation in Nevada. She was black and tan like Thor, with the same intelligent amber eyes and protective instincts. The Montana State Police had offered Bob early retirement with full benefits after the grain elevator case, but he'd declined. Instead, he'd transferred to the K-9 Training Division, where he was establishing the Thor Foundation, a program dedicated to training rescue dogs specifically for child protection work. Luna was his first trainee, and she showed remarkable promise. During their morning session, she'd successfully tracked a missing child scenario in record time, then immediately positioned herself protectively around the victim until help arrived. Bob saw something familiar in her behavior, a dedication that went beyond training. "She's got Thor's heart," Bob said to the training supervisor who was observing the session. "Same instincts, same drive to protect the innocent." That evening, Bob returned to his house on Elm Street. It didn't feel empty anymore. Luna followed him inside, immediately making herself comfortable on the dog bed that had once belonged to Thor. Bob had kept everything exactly the same: the food bowls, the toys, the bed by the fireplace where Thor used to sleep. As he prepared dinner, Bob's phone rang. It was Dylan Murphy's mother calling with their weekly update. Dylan was doing well in school, seeing a counselor regularly, and had started a campaign at his elementary school to raise money for police dog training. He'd raised $347 so far, mostly in quarters and dollar bills from his classmates. "He says Thor visits him in his dreams," Dylan's mother told Bob. "He's not having nightmares anymore. And just dreams about playing fetch with a big dog who keeps him safe." Bob smiled as he hung up the phone. Luna looked up at him from her bed, tail wagging gently. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, but the house felt warm and full of purpose. Some heroes have 4 legs and hearts bigger than most humans ever develop. They don't ask for recognition or reward, only the chance to serve, to protect, to love unconditionally. Thor had taught Bob that family isn't always about blood or traditional bonds. Sometimes it's about who you choose to protect, who you're willing to die for, who gives your life meaning when everything else falls apart. The empty rooms in Bob's house were empty no longer. They were filled with Luna's presence, with the echoes of Thor's legacy, and with the knowledge that somewhere out there, 27 children were sleeping safely in their own beds because one dog had chosen to bark at exactly the right moment. At 62, Bob Mitchell discovered something most of us spend our entire lives searching for: that family isn't defined by biology or circumstance, but by the love we choose to give when others need it most. Like Bob, many of you have faced the quiet ache of empty rooms, unfulfilled dreams of children's laughter filling your homes, or the profound loneliness that follows losing a spouse. But Bob's story reminds us that our greatest chapters can be written in our later years, when wisdom meets opportunity and courage overcomes fear. Thor, a rescue dog with his own painful past, became Bob's partner in purpose, proving that healing often comes through serving others. Together, they didn't just save 27 children. They discovered that love multiplies when we open our hearts to unexpected family. Whether it's mentoring neighborhood kids, volunteering with animal rescues, or simply being the steady presence someone desperately needs, your life experience has prepared you for moments that matter. The children you never had might be the ones still waiting for a grandparent figure to believe in them. Your story isn't ending. It's evolving into something beautiful and necessary. What unexpected family has entered your life when you least expected it? Have you ever had a moment where helping someone else healed something broken inside you? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.